There is a particular kind of silence that falls over the water just before a brigantine appears. Not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of something arriving, of wind filling canvas in a way that feels almost too deliberate, too sure of itself. Sailors who had seen one before knew to feel their stomachs drop first. The silhouette was unmistakable. Two masts, cutting against the sky like a pair of dark accusations. One rigged with square sails that caught the broadest breath of open ocean wind. The other, the aft mast, fitted with a fore and aft sail that allowed her to do something square-rigged vessels simply could not. To sail close to the wind, at angles that seemed to defy the logic of how ships were supposed to move. She could run, she could chase, she could vanish into a narrow channel that had no business accommodating a ship of her size. And she could reappear somewhere no one expected her to be. The Brigantine was not the largest ship on the golden age of sail. She was not the most heavily armed. She did not carry the broadside of a man of war, nor the cargo hold of a great merchantman. What she carried was something far more dangerous to her enemies and far more useful to those who commanded her. She carried options. The origins of this remarkable vessel reach back to the Mediterranean, somewhere in the slow crucible of the 16th century, where the demands of trade and the constant threat of piracy from the Barbary coast forced shipwrights to think differently about what a vessel needed to do. The early brigantines were smaller, many of them oar-driven as well as sailed, hybrids of necessity, built to move in conditions where the wind refused to cooperate. The word itself is thought to derive from the Italian brigantino, meaning, with remarkable honesty, a vessel used by brigands. She was named for what she was. The sea has always appreciated that kind of directness. As the 16th century gave way to the 17th, and trade routes expanded across the Atlantic and into the Caribbean, the brigantine evolved. She grew. Shipwrights in Dutch and English yards adapted her lines for open ocean voyaging, deepening her hull, refining the rigging configuration that would become her signature. By the early 1700s, she had become one of the most capable vessels on any ocean, able to make speed in light winds that left heavier ships becalmed and helpless, able to maneuver in shallow coastal waters where pursuing warships feared to follow, and able, crucially, to be crewed by a surprisingly small number of men. For a pirate captain operating in a world of shifting loyalties and uncertain provisions, that last quality was not a minor advantage. It was everything. In combat, a well-handled brigantine was not something to be taken lightly. She was fast enough, on a good reach of wind, to run down most merchant vessels before they could even begin to think about resistance. Her fore and aft rigging on the mainmast gave her the ability to tack with a speed and efficiency that pure square riggers envied. She could carry a respectable number of cannons, typically between 10 and 18 guns in her Golden Age configuration, enough to persuade almost any merchant captain that the arithmetic of resistance simply did not favor him. And in the hands of a captain who understood her, who had learned the particular conversation between her hull and the sea, she became something close to an extension of will itself. Not a vessel you sailed, a vessel you thought through. There are names attached to brigantines that history has not forgotten. There are chases recorded in the logs of colonial governors that read less like nautical reports and more like fever dreams. A vessel appearing out of morning haze, running down a ship twice her apparent size, firing a warning shot with the casual confidence of a man who already knew how the story ended. The brigantine appears in naval dispatches from the Caribbean, the Atlantic coast of the American colonies, the waters off West Africa, and the shipping lanes of the Indian Ocean, always described in similar terms: swift, elusive, and unnerving in the competence of those who crewed her. And yet, for all her appearances in history, the brigantine is most indelibly associated with one era, one theater of operation, one constellation of captains who understood her capabilities as well as anyone who ever set foot on a wooden deck. The Golden Age of Piracy, roughly 1680 to 730. 50 years that the Caribbean and the Atlantic would not soon forget. Among those captains, the calculating ones, the ones who survived longer than probability should have allowed, one name rises with particular force. A man who did not merely use the Brigantine as a tool, but who understood her as a philosophy. A man whose very reputation was built, in part, on what this ship allowed him to do and to become. But we are not yet ready for him. First, we must understand the vessel itself. We must walk her decks, feel the logic of her design, and hear the story of how she came to be the most feared silhouette on the water. Because when you understand the ship, you begin to understand everything else. She begins as timber. That is where every ship begins, of course, in the forest, not the sea. But with the Brigantine, the choice of wood was not incidental. It was foundational to everything she would later be asked to do. The great shipyards of 17th and early 18th century Europe, those busy, noisy, perpetually sawdust-covered operations in Amsterdam, Bristol, Portsmouth, and later in the colonial yards of New England and the Caribbean, understood that a ship built for speed and maneuverability demanded something specific from her materials. She needed to be strong enough to take punishment, light enough to move, and flexible enough, in the deep grammar of her construction, to survive the kind of sailing that cautious captains never attempted. The keel was laid first. Always the keel. This was the spine of the vessel, a single continuous timber running the full length of the ship's bottom. And in a brigantine of the early 1700s, that keel might stretch anywhere from 50 to 100 feet, depending on the ambitions of the builder and the intended purpose of the vessel. English shipwrights favored oak, dense, durable, resistant to the particular violence that salt water and barnacles inflict on submerged wood over time. In the American colonies, where English oak was scarce, but the forests were seemingly inexhaustible, live oak from the Carolina and Georgia coastlines became the timber of choice. It was heavier than English oak, but remarkably resistant to rot, and, in a world where a ship's longevity was directly tied to her captain's survival, that quality was not something anyone was inclined to compromise on. From the keel rose the frames, the ribs of the ship, curving upward and outward on both sides, in a shape that a modern eye might recognize as the cross-section of a shallow bowl. These frames were typically fashioned from naturally curved timber, pieces of wood that had grown in the right shape rather than being forced into it, because a shipwright in the age of sail understood something that engineers would later spend considerable effort proving mathematically, that a structure built along the grain of its material is fundamentally stronger than one built against it. The frames were then planked over, the hull boards fastened with wooden pegs called trenails, pronounced with the magnificent stubbornness of maritime tradition as trunnels, and later, on better-funded vessels, with iron spikes as well. The hull of a brigantine was distinctive in profile. She sat lower in the water than a ship of the line, her freeboard. The distance between the waterline and the top of her hull, deliberately modest. This was not a flaw. It was a decision. A lower hull meant less surface area for wind to push against when the wind was coming from an unfavorable direction. It meant she presented a smaller target to enemy gunners, and it meant that her center of gravity sat closer to the water, giving her a stability under sail that allowed her crew to carry more canvas in conditions that would have forced a taller, more top-heavy vessel to reef her sails and proceed with considerably more caution and considerably less speed. Her two masts were the heart of what made her different. The foremast, the forward mast, was square-rigged. This meant it carried yards, horizontal spars crossed perpendicular to the mast, from which the square sails were suspended, and from which they fell in the wind like great rectangular curtains of canvas. Square sails are, in the most fundamental sense, the sails of the open ocean. They are designed to catch a wind coming from behind or from the side, a following wind or a beam reach, and to convert that wind into pure forward momentum with an efficiency that no other sail configuration of the era could match. When the trade winds were blowing and a brigantine captain had them at his back, that foremast and its square canvas could drive the ship to speeds that made pursuit by heavier vessels a theoretical exercise rather than a practical threat. The mainmast, the aftmast, told a different story. Here, the brigantine departed from the logic of the great square-rigged ships of the line, and it is in this departure that her genius resided. The mainmast was rigged fore and aft, carrying a large sail whose boom ran along the center line of the ship rather than across it. This configuration, related to the lateen sails of the Mediterranean that had influenced the brigantine's earliest ancestors, allowed the sail to be trimmed at a much wider range of angles to the wind. Where a square-rigged ship needed the wind to be coming from roughly behind or beside her to make good progress, the brigantine's fore and aft main could be sheeted in tight and allow the ship to sail at an angle close to the wind's direction, not directly into it. No sail can do that, but close enough that a brigantine could make useful progress in directions that left her square-rigged contemporaries wallowing, slatting their canvas, and going nowhere useful at all. The combination of these two rigs on a single vessel created something that naval architects would spend the next 2 centuries trying to improve upon, and rarely bettering: a ship that was fast downwind, capable upwind, and adaptable in the constantly shifting wind conditions of the Caribbean and the Atlantic seaboard, in ways that neither a pure square rigger nor a pure fore and aft vessel could match alone. She was, in the vocabulary of sail, what we might today call a hybrid solution. But hybrid makes it sound like a compromise. It was not a compromise, it was a synthesis. Below decks, the brigantine's interior was organized with the ruthless practicality of a vessel where every cubic foot of space had to earn its place. The hold occupied the lowest level, deep in the belly of the ship beneath the waterline, where the ballast, typically gravel, sand, or iron pigs, was stored low and central to keep the vessel stable. Above the ballast sat whatever cargo or provisions the voyage demanded. For a merchant brigantine, this might mean barrels of molasses, hogsheads of tobacco, bales of indigo, or crates of manufactured goods from English factories. For a pirate brigantine, the hold told a more complicated story. Captured goods stacked alongside provisions for weeks or months at sea, powder kegs wrapped carefully in oilskin against the perpetual damp, and the supplies of salted meat and ship's biscuit that kept a crew functional, if not particularly content. The between-deck space, the area between the hold and the main deck, was where the crew lived, and lived is perhaps a generous word for what happened there. A brigantine's crew, typically ranging from 50 to 150 men in a pirate configuration, occupied a space that modern sensibilities would find almost incomprehensible. Hammocks were slung wherever the beams allowed, often so close together that a sleeping man's shoulder touched his neighbor's. The smell was extraordinary in the way that only enclosed spaces inhabited by large numbers of unwashed human beings for extended periods can be extraordinary. Light came through the gun ports when they were open and through the hatchways, and in heavy weather, when both were closed against the sea, the between decks of a brigantine became something that required a particular kind of mental fortitude to endure without complaint. And yet men chose this life, chose it over alternatives that, on the face of things, seemed considerably more comfortable. That fact alone tells you something important about what life on land was offering the men of the early 18th century. The gun deck on a pirate brigantine was the space that most concerned her enemies. The cannons, typically 4-pounders or 6-pounders in smaller configurations, with some vessels mounting 9-pounders on their main battery, were positioned along the ship's sides, their muzzles projecting through the gun ports in that posture of patient threat that has represented maritime power for centuries. A brigantine might carry 8 guns on a side, 16 in total, which was not the broadsides of a ship of the line but was more than sufficient for the work she was typically asked to do. The cannons were supplemented by swivel guns, smaller, faster weapons mounted on the rail that could be brought to bear quickly and used to sweep an enemy's deck before boarding. It was the swivel guns, often, that made a merchant crew decide that cooperation was the wiser course of action. The captain's cabin sat at the stern beneath the quarterdeck, and in a well-appointed brigantine it represented the one space aboard where something approaching comfort was available. Windows, the great stern windows that are one of the most romantically recognizable features of the age of sail, looked out over the ship's wake. A table, a chart, perhaps a chair of some quality, books, if the captain was of that inclination, instruments, the compass, the quadrant, the dividers and parallel rules that were the tools of navigation in an era before GPS made finding one's position on the open ocean a matter of glancing at a telephone. Navigation in the early 18th century was a discipline that blended mathematics, experience, and an intimate knowledge of the sea's own moods. A brigantine captain worth his commission could read the color of the water and estimate depth. He could watch the behavior of seabirds and infer proximity to land. He could take a noon sighting with his quadrant and, through a calculation that had been refined over generations, determine his latitude with reasonable precision. Longitude was harder. The reliable marine chronometer would not arrive until later in the century, and so dead reckoning, the practice of tracking one's position through careful attention to speed, heading, and elapsed time, was the art that separated the captains who arrived where they intended from those who did not arrive at all. The quarterdeck, above the captain's cabin, was where the ship was steered and commanded. The helmsman stood at the whipstaff or, on later brigantines, the ship's wheel, translating the captain's orders into the subtle and constant adjustments that kept the vessel on her heading. The binnacle, the housing for the compass, stood nearby, and in the dark watches of the night it was often the only light permitted on deck, its faint glow illuminating the compass card and the helmsman's face in equal measure while the rest of the ship moved through darkness. To stand on the quarterdeck of a brigantine under full sail, in a good breeze on a broad reach, was, by every account that survives from the era, to feel something close to exhilaration, the ship alive beneath your feet, the rigging singing at its own particular pitch, the bow lifting and driving through the swells with a rhythm that, once you had learned it, your body never entirely forgot. She was a machine, yes, wood and rope and canvas and iron, but she was a machine that behaved, in the hands of those who understood her, with something very close to intention. And in the years between roughly 1700 and 1720, a small number of men on the Atlantic and Caribbean learned to speak her language more fluently than anyone before or since. We are nearly ready to meet them, to understand why the brigantine became the vessel of choice for the most dangerous men of the early 18th century. You must first understand the world those men were operating inside, and that world was, by almost any measure, extraordinary. The Caribbean basin in the years between 1680 and 730 was not a place that operated by the rules that governed life on land. It was, in the most literal sense, a frontier, one drawn not in soil and stone, but in salt water and wind, stretching across thousands of square miles of ocean between islands that changed European hands so frequently that the flags flying over their forts sometimes changed before the paint on the previous flag's pole had finished drying. England, Spain, France, the Netherlands, Denmark, all of them had claims here, and all of them pursued those claims with a mixture of military force, commercial ambition, and a diplomatic dishonesty so consistent it had become almost a formal language of its own. The trade that flowed through these waters was staggering in its volume and in its human cost. Sugar, the great engine of Caribbean wealth, moved northward and eastward in an almost continuous stream of merchant shipping. Tobacco, cotton, indigo, rum, in quantities that would have astonished a modern observer. And beneath all of it, sustaining all of it in a way that the merchants and aristocrats who profited from it preferred not to examine too carefully: the slave trade. One of the great moral catastrophes of human history, conducted with the brisk efficiency of men who had learned to think of suffering as a line item in an account book. The ships carrying this wealth moved along routes that were, by necessity, predictable. Trade winds are not optional. Ocean currents are not negotiable. A merchant captain sailing from Jamaica to Bristol in 1710 took roughly the same route that a merchant captain had taken 20 years before and would take 20 years after, because the wind and water offered no meaningful alternative. This predictability, which was simply a fact of geography, was also an invitation, and the men who responded to that invitation, who positioned themselves along those routes, in the shallow waters and hidden anchorages and narrow channels that the larger naval vessels of the European powers could not easily reach, were the pirates of the Golden Age. They came from everywhere and nowhere in particular. Some were former privateers, men who had carried government-issued letters of marque during the various wars of the late 17th century, authorizing them to attack enemy shipping on behalf of their sponsoring crown. When the wars ended and the letters expired, these men found themselves possessed of a very specific and now technically illegal set of skills, operating in a world that offered them very little in the way of respectable alternative employment. The transition from privateer to pirate required less moral adjustment than most official histories have been comfortable acknowledging. Others came from the merchant marine itself, sailors who had experienced the brutal conditions of legitimate seafaring, the arbitrary violence of incompetent or sadistic officers, the wages that rarely materialized in full, the food that was never quite what had been promised, and who had decided, with a practicality that is difficult entirely to condemn, that if the sea was going to be their life, they would at least conduct that life on their own terms. Still others were men for whom the land had become genuinely uninhabitable. Debtors, escaped bondsmen, military deserters, men who had committed acts ashore that made returning to any port flying a European flag a death sentence in its own right. The sea received them all. The pirate crews of the Golden Age were, in their composition, among the most genuinely international communities of their era. English and African, French and Dutch, indigenous and colonial American, sailing and fighting and arguing, and occasionally dying together, in a way that the rigidly hierarchical societies of the European powers would have found deeply troubling had they looked at it long enough to see what it actually was. And the ship they chose, when they had the freedom to choose, was the Brigantine. The reasons were both practical and strategic, and they are worth examining carefully because they illuminate something important about how the Golden Age of piracy actually functioned, which was nothing like the popular imagination tends to suppose. A common misunderstanding about pirates of this era is that they sought out large, heavily armed vessels and engaged in the kind of thunderous broadside-to-broadside combat that fills the paintings hanging in maritime museums. In reality, a pirate captain who found himself in a prolonged artillery exchange with a well-armed opponent had, in most cases, already made a serious error of judgment. The business model of piracy, and it was a business model conducted with more commercial logic than romance, was predicated on the threat of violence rather than its repeated application. A merchant ship that could be persuaded to surrender without a fight cost nothing to take. One that had to be battered into submission cost powder, shot, rigging, men, and time. Time being perhaps the most precious commodity of all, because time spent in one location on predictable sea lanes was time in which a naval patrol might appear over the horizon. Speed, therefore, was not a luxury. It was the foundational requirement, and the Brigantine delivered it. She could, in favorable conditions, make 8 or 9 knots, perhaps more, in a strong following wind with her square sails drawing well. This was faster than the heavily laden merchant vessels she typically pursued, which might make 5 or 6 knots under similar conditions. It was frequently faster than the naval sloops and frigates sent to catch her, which were often older, fouled with growth on their hulls, or simply not built for the specific combination of speed and maneuverability that the Brigantine offered. The ability to careen, to deliberately beach a vessel on a remote shore and clean and recork her hull, was something pirate crews attended to with more diligence than their naval counterparts, and a clean hull in these warm Caribbean waters, where growth accumulated with alarming speed, could mean the difference between a vessel that flew and one that merely moved. The shallow draft of the Brigantine, her ability to operate in water that was too shoal for larger vessels, gave her something that no amount of guns could provide: sanctuary. The Bahamas, with their extraordinary labyrinth of shallow banks and cays, became the operational center of the golden age of piracy, in no small part because the waters there were navigable only to those who knew them and who sailed vessels shallow enough to thread through them. Nassau, on New Providence Island, became the closest thing the golden age had to a pirate capital, and it was a capital defended not by fortifications but by geography, by the simple fact that the Royal Navy's ships of the line could not follow where the brigantines led. This is not a minor point. It is, in many ways, the central tactical reality of the entire era. The year 1730 deserves particular attention in any serious account of this period. The Treaty of Utrecht, signed in that year, ended the War of the Spanish Succession, and in doing so unleashed upon the Atlantic and Caribbean a wave of newly unemployed privateers and sailors that the maritime world was entirely unprepared to absorb. Thousands of men who had spent years conducting legal maritime violence were suddenly without commissions, without income, and without any realistic prospect of either in a peacetime economy that had no particular need for their skills. The naval establishments of England, Spain, and France demobilized with the cheerful indifference to human consequence that governments have always displayed when wars end, and the men who fought them become inconvenient. The result was predictable. Piracy, which had been declining in the years before Utrecht as wartime privateering absorbed the available pool of maritime adventurers, surged. The years between 1730 and 1726 represent the peak of the Golden Age, the period in which the names that history has preserved were making themselves known along the shipping lanes. Benjamin Hornigold, Charles Vane, Anne Bonny and Mary Read, whose presence in the historical record continues to challenge every lazy assumption about who crewed these vessels and what they were capable of. Bartholomew Roberts, who would go on to capture more than 400 vessels, and who dressed for battle with a theatrical splendor that suggested he understood, at some level, that he was performing a role as much as conducting a military operation. Calico Jack Rackham, Samuel Bellamy, the self-styled Robin Hood of the sea, whose egalitarian instincts were genuine enough to be recorded by multiple contemporaries, and whose end, in a nor'easter off Cape Cod in 1717, was one of the era's great tragedies, and Edward Teach, known to history and to the nightmares of an entire generation of merchant sailors as Blackbeard. He will have his own segment. He deserves it. But to understand Blackbeard, you must first understand what the world had become by the time he emerged into it. A world where the Caribbean was effectively ungoverned, where the Royal Navy was stretched impossibly thin across responsibilities that spanned half the globe, where colonial governors ranged from the genuinely committed to the nakedly corrupt, and where a man of intelligence and ruthlessness and genuine nautical ability could, if he chose the right vessel and the right waters, operate with a freedom that the rigid social hierarchies of European civilization made completely impossible on land. The Brigantine was not incidental to this story. She was the mechanism by which the story became possible. Without her speed, the merchant ships simply sail away. Without her shallow draft, the naval patrols simply follow into the shallows and end the matter with firepower. Without her relatively small crew requirement, The economics of piracy collapse. Too many men sharing too small a prize. The Brigantine solved all of these problems simultaneously and elegantly, which is why, when you read through the colonial records of the period, through the governor's dispatches and the naval logs and the depositions of captured pirates and the testimonies of their victims, the Brigantine appears again and again and again, always described in terms that make clear the respect and the fear that her silhouette inspired. There is a dispatch in the records of the governor of Jamaica, written sometime around 1707, that describes the sighting of a brigantine off the eastern point of the island, moving at a speed the reporting officer found difficult to credit, given the apparent condition of the wind. He wrote, with the clipped precision of a man trained to make official reports, that the vessel appeared to be sailing faster than the wind ought reasonably to allow. He was not mystified by witchcraft. He was observing the product of intelligent design, skillfully applied. He was watching, though he did not know it yet, the signature vessel of an era that was already reaching its extraordinary peak. And somewhere on that water, on a deck that smelled of tar and salt, and the particular masculine density of men living close together in difficult circumstances, a captain who understood this ship better than almost anyone else alive was looking back at the Jamaican coastline and making calculations. The world was wide, the sea was deep, and the Brigantine moved through both with the confidence of something that had been built from its very first timber for exactly this. His name was probably Edward Teach. Probably. The historical record on Blackbeard's origins is, with a fitting sense of drama, almost deliberately obscure. Some accounts give his birthplace as Bristol. Others suggest London. A few, less convincingly, place him in the American colonies. The year of his birth is similarly elusive. Somewhere in the late 1600s, most historians agree, which would have made him a man in his late 20s or early 30s during the years that made him famous. For a figure who would become one of the most recognized names in the entire history of maritime violence, the almost total absence of reliable biographical detail from his early life is remarkable. It is as though the man himself understood, even before history was paying attention, that mystery was a resource, that the less people knew about where you came from, the larger the space in which imagination could construct something far more terrifying than the truth. What is certain is this: by 1716, Edward Teach was sailing under Benjamin Hornigold, one of the founding figures of the Nassau pirate community, and a captain of considerable experience and strategic intelligence. Hornigold recognized in Teach something that experienced commanders occasionally recognize in younger subordinates, a quality that is difficult to name precisely but impossible to miss. A combination of physical presence, tactical instinct, and what can only be described as a gift for psychological warfare that went far beyond anything that could be taught or learned from books. Hornigold gave Teach increasing responsibility, and Teach, characteristically, made the most of it. By 1717, Teach had command of his own vessel, and the vessel he chose, or was given, the record is not entirely clear on the precise mechanism, was a brigantine. She was called the Revenge, formerly a sloop, though accounts vary, and carrying perhaps 12 guns in her pirate configuration. She was not, by any measure, the largest or most powerful vessel on the Caribbean at that moment, but in Teach's hands, she began immediately to demonstrate what a brigantine under intelligent command was capable of. Within months of taking independent command, Teach had taken multiple prizes along the Atlantic seaboard, his reputation spreading through the merchant community with the particular speed that bad news has always traveled among people whose livelihoods depend on safe passage between ports. The Revenge was only the beginning, because in November of 1707, Edward Teach encountered a vessel that would change everything, for him, for his victims, and for the history of the golden age of piracy. The Concorde was a French slave ship, 350 tons, 26 guns, making her way through the eastern Caribbean when Teach's Brigantine and a consort vessel appeared and brought her to. The French captain, with the pragmatism that characterized most merchant officers when confronted with a force they could not overcome, surrendered without meaningful resistance. The cargo and provisions were taken, but Teach wanted more than the cargo. He wanted the ship herself. And here we see with great clarity both the ambition of the man and his understanding of what a larger, more powerful vessel could mean for the scope of his operations. The Concorde was refitted. Her guns were increased, ultimately to 40, though she carried varying armaments at different points in her career. She was renamed with a theatrical instinct that runs through Blackbeard's entire public persona like a bright thread, the Queen Anne's Revenge. She was not a brigantine. She was a full-rigged ship, a three-masted vessel of a size that put her in an entirely different category from the vessel Teach had commanded before. And this fact is worth pausing on, because it tells us something important about how Teach actually thought about naval warfare and about the relationship between ship type and strategic purpose. Teach did not abandon the Brigantine when he acquired the Queen Anne's Revenge. He kept smaller, faster vessels in company, brigantines and sloops, that served as scouts, as pursuers when a prize attempted to run, and as the vessels that could go where the larger ship could not follow. The Queen Anne's Revenge was a statement. She was the vessel that appeared on the horizon and made merchant captains reach immediately for white flags. But the brigantines that sailed with her were the working instruments of the operation. The vessels that actually ran down prizes, that explored shallow anchorages that could be sent ahead to reconnoiter a situation before the flagship committed herself. This is the operational sophistication that tends to get lost in popular accounts of Blackbeard, which focus so heavily on the theatrics of the man. The burning fuses woven into his beard, the pistols and cutlasses, the deliberate cultivation of a demonic persona, that the genuine tactical intelligence underneath sometimes goes unremarked. Teach ran what was, by the standards of the era, a complex multi-vessel operation. He understood the different capabilities of different ship types, the way a competent military commander understands the different capabilities of different units. He used them accordingly. The Burning Beard deserves a moment of attention, because it is one of the most vivid and least understood episodes in the entire Blackbeard story. Before engaging a prize or entering a confrontation, Teach would light slow-burning fuses, lengths of hemp cord treated with saltpeter and lime, and tuck them beneath the brim of his hat, so that they smoldered around his face during the encounter. In the smoke and chaos of a deck action, in the lurid half-light of a vessel under fire, with a man of Teach's already considerable physical stature advancing through the haze, with what appeared to be his head wreathed in smoke and fire. The psychological effect on the opposing crew was, by all contemporary accounts, devastating. This was not madness. It was stagecraft of the highest order. Blackbeard understood something that military commanders across history have understood, and that modern psychology has extensively documented, that the willingness to fight is not a fixed quantity. It is a variable, and it can be manipulated. A merchant crew that believed they were facing something between a man and a demon, something that burned without being consumed, that advanced without apparent fear, that seemed to operate by rules different from those governing ordinary human beings, was a crew whose will to resist had already been substantially eroded before a single cannonball was fired. The fewer shots fired, the lower the cost of the operation. The lower the cost of the operation, the more sustainable the enterprise. Blackbeard was, beneath the theater, running a business, and the Burning Beard was marketing. The blockade of Charleston in May of 1718 stands as perhaps the most audacious single operation of Blackbeard's career, and it is worth examining in some detail, because it illustrates perfectly how the Brigantine and her companion vessels functioned in his hands. For approximately a week, Teach positioned his small fleet, the Queen Anne's Revenge and several smaller consorts, brigantines and sloops among them. at the entrance to Charleston Harbor, one of the most important ports on the American colonial seaboard. During this time, he intercepted and held multiple vessels attempting to enter or leave the port. He took prisoners from among Charleston's prominent citizens, and then, with a boldness that the colonial authorities found simultaneously outrageous and entirely unanswerable, he sent a delegation ashore with a demand: a chest of medicines for the treatment of the diseases that were working through his crew. Not gold, not silver, medicine. The colonial government of South Carolina, faced with a force they could not immediately counter and hostages they could not afford to sacrifice, complied. It is difficult to read this episode without a certain involuntary admiration for the sheer nerve involved. Blackbeard had effectively held a major colonial port to ransom and extracted his demand, and the demand itself, medicine for sick sailors, has a quality to it that cuts somewhat against the pure villain narrative. The men were sick. He got them medicine. The method was indefensible by any conventional standard, but the internal logic was not entirely without its own coherence. The smaller vessels in his fleet, the brigantines and sloops, were essential to the operation. They were the vessels that intercepted incoming and outgoing shipping, that could move quickly to chase down a vessel attempting to run, that maintained the effective blockade, while the larger Queen Anne's Revenge served as the unmistakable central threat. Without them, the blockade could not have been maintained. A single large ship, however heavily armed, cannot cover the approaches to a harbor. A coordinated fleet, combining the firepower of a ship of the line with the speed and maneuverability of brigantines, can. He grounded the Queen Anne's Revenge shortly after the Charleston blockade, deliberately, most historians now believe, as a way of reducing his crew and simplifying his operation. Whether this was a calculated tactical decision or the result of factors more complicated than they appear in the surviving record remains a matter of genuine historical debate. But what is certain is that after the grounding, Teach reverted to smaller vessels, back to the brigantine and sloop configurations that had served him in his earlier career. He was, in a sense, coming home to the vessel that suited him best. The final months of Blackbeard's life trace an arc that has the quality of inevitability that good tragedy always possesses, where you can see exactly where things are heading while being unable to look away from the journey. He operated out of Ocracoke Inlet on the North Carolina coast, a location chosen with the geographic intelligence that characterized all of his best decisions. The inlet was shallow. The approaches were treacherous to anyone who did not know them intimately. The colonial governor of North Carolina, Charles Eden, was either corrupt enough or pragmatic enough to extend a degree of tolerance toward Teach's presence that the governor of Virginia, Alexander Spotswood, found intolerable. Spotswood moved against Teach. In November of 1718, he dispatched 2 small naval vessels, sloops, shallow enough to navigate the Ocracoke approaches, under the command of Lieutenant Robert Maynard, a naval officer of demonstrated competence and a personal courage that the subsequent events would prove beyond any reasonable doubt. The Battle of Ocracoke Inlet, fought on the morning of November 22nd, 1718, was brief, violent, and decisive. Teach's vessel, a small sloop called the Adventure, engaged Maynard's 2 vessels in the shallow waters of the inlet. Maynard lost men in the initial exchange of fire. He famously ordered his surviving crew below decks, leaving the upper deck apparently empty, drawing Teach's men aboard in what they believed was a boarding of a largely unmanned vessel. They found instead Maynard's crew coming up from below. What followed was hand-to-hand combat of the most brutal and immediate kind. Blackbeard and Maynard fought directly. The naval lieutenant and the most notorious pirate of the age, in the shallow, cold water light of a November morning in North Carolina. By the accounts that survive, Teach was shot multiple times and continued fighting. He was wounded with bladed weapons and continued fighting. He had, in the final accounting, 5 bullet wounds and some 20 cuts before he fell. The head was taken, the body thrown overboard. And with that, the most famous chapter of the Golden Age closed. But the vessel that had made his career possible, the Brigantine, swift and shallow and ruthlessly practical, outlasted him by centuries. She was always going to. The Golden Age of piracy did not end with a single moment. It ended the way most eras end, gradually, then all at once, with the gradual part stretching across years, and the all at once arriving in a cluster of events so concentrated that historians looking back can point to a rough decade and say, there, that is where it turned. The executions mounted. The naval patrols intensified. The colonial governments, most of them, ceased to be quite so conveniently tolerant of men like Blackbeard and Bartholomew Roberts operating in their waters. Woodes Rogers arrived in Nassau in 1718, with a royal pardon in one hand and a hangman's rope in the other, and with a practical efficiency that left little room for sentiment, he dismantled the pirate republic that had flourished there for the better part of a decade. Roberts was killed in 1722. By the mid-720s, the men and women who had defined the era were dead, imprisoned, or had accepted pardons and retreated into the ambiguous respectability of reformed criminals. The Brigantine, however, did none of these things. She did not retreat. She did not reform. She simply continued, as she had always done, to be extraordinarily useful. And usefulness, in the long accounting of maritime history, is the quality that determines a vessel's survival far more reliably than fame or notoriety. The years following the Golden Age saw the Brigantine move, without particular fanfare, back into the mainstream of Atlantic commerce, where she had always had a legitimate presence alongside her more notorious career. Merchants who had feared her silhouette in 1715 were commissioning her construction in 1730, because the same qualities that had made her dangerous in pirate hands made her commercially valuable in legitimate ones. Speed meant shorter passages. Shorter passages meant fresher cargo and faster turnover. The ability to enter shallow harbors that larger vessels could not access meant she could serve ports and anchorages that the great merchantmen bypassed, opening trade routes that would otherwise have remained economically marginal. The colonial American trade, in particular, embraced the Brigantine with an enthusiasm that the surviving shipping records make very clear. The ports of New England, Boston, Salem, Newport, Providence sent brigantines across the Atlantic to the Mediterranean and back, loaded with fish and timber outbound, wine and manufactured goods on the return. They sailed south to the Caribbean with provisions and lumber, returning with sugar and rum and the commercial energy that was slowly building the economies of the American seaboard into something that would eventually surprise everyone, including the colonists themselves, with its scale and ambition. The Brigantine suited the colonial merchant for the same reason she had suited the pirate captain. She was versatile enough to serve multiple routes and multiple cargo types, small enough to be economically viable on runs that could not fill the hold of a larger vessel, and fast enough to make passages that kept her competitive with better capitalized competitors running larger, more expensive ships. She was, in the economic vocabulary of the era, a workhorse that occasionally moved like a racehorse. That combination does not go out of fashion. The American Revolution, when it arrived in the 1770s, found the Brigantine ready. The Continental Navy, assembled with considerable urgency and considerably limited resources in the early years of the conflict, could not compete with the Royal Navy in ships of the line. No one with any mathematical competence expected it to. What the Continental Navy could do, and what it did with a creativity born of necessity, was harass. It could intercept supply ships. It could threaten coastal trade. It could force the Royal Navy to disperse its attention and resources in ways that complicated British strategy, even when individual engagements were inconclusive. For this kind of work, fast, mobile, operating in coastal waters, capable of running from anything it could not fight, and fighting anything it could not run from. The Brigantine was very nearly perfect. American privateers of the Revolutionary period commissioned and crewed brigantines in numbers that tell their own story about the vessel's reputation. The letters of marque issued by the Continental Congress authorized dozens of brigantines to operate against British commerce, and they did so with an effectiveness that infuriated British merchants and complicated the Royal Navy's already considerable logistical challenges. The parallels with the Golden Age pirates were not lost on contemporary observers, some of whom noted them with amusement and others with something closer to anxiety. John Paul Jones, the most celebrated American naval figure of the Revolution, a man whose famous declaration that he had not yet begun to fight has echoed down through American military mythology for 2.5 centuries, commanded vessels of various types throughout his career, and his understanding of the brigantine's capabilities informed his entire approach to naval warfare, which prioritized speed, surprise, and psychological effect over the broadside. 2 broadside slugging matches that larger vessels conducted. He was, in temperament and tactical instinct, closer to the great pirate captains of the previous generation than most patriotic histories have been entirely comfortable acknowledging. The sea produces a certain type of mind, regardless of whose flag it flies under. As the 18th century gave way to the 19th, the brigantine underwent a subtle but significant evolution that reflected the changing demands of global trade. The pure brigantine rig, foremast square-rigged, mainmast fore and aft, was joined by a variation that became so common it eventually acquired its own name, the hermaphrodite brig or brig schooner, sometimes simply called a brigantine in common usage despite the technical distinction. This variant carried square sails on the foremast in the traditional manner, but replaced the large fore and aft mainsail with a schooner-style rig on the main, with the gaff-rigged sails that were becoming increasingly popular as the century progressed, and as naval architects accumulated more data on the comparative efficiency of different sail configurations. The distinction matters less than the underlying principle, which remained constant: the combination of square and fore and aft rigging on a 2-masted vessel that sat somewhere between the pure square rigger and the pure fore and aft schooner, capturing the advantages of both while avoiding the worst limitations of either. Different builders in different ports called the resulting vessels by slightly different names, argued about the precise definitions with the earnest intensity that maritime professionals have always brought to questions of nomenclature, and then built more of them anyway because the market kept asking for them. The 19th century saw brigantines working every significant ocean trade route on the planet. They carried grain from the Baltic. They worked the coasting trade along the American eastern seaboard. They penetrated the Pacific, following the trade routes that opened as American and European commercial interest expanded into waters that had previously been the almost exclusive province of Spanish galleons and the vessels of the East India Companies. They appeared in the Mediterranean, familiar in those waters that had given birth to their earliest ancestors 3 centuries before, still doing the work that the Mediterranean had always demanded, moving cargo quickly between ports that were too small, too shallow, or too commercially marginal for the great ships to bother with. The deep water trade to the Pacific coast of South America, the nitrate and guano trades that fed European and American agriculture in the mid-19th century, employed brigantines alongside larger barques and full-rigged ships, the smaller vessels finding their niche in the feeder routes and coastal work that connected the main cargo ports to the smaller loading points along the Chilean and Peruvian coast. It was hard, often brutal work in waters that demanded the best from both vessels and men. The Pacific Ocean off South America being one of the more reliably unpleasant sailing environments on the planet, with its cold Humboldt current, its unpredictable weather patterns, and its coastline of spectacular and largely indifferent grandeur. The brigantine's military career continued well past the Golden Age as well, though in forms that were considerably more regulated and considerably less colorful than her piratical years. The navies of the major European powers maintained brigantines and brig-rigged vessels in their inventories throughout the 18th and into the 19th centuries, typically as dispatch vessels, survey ships, and coastal patrol craft. They were, in naval service, what they had always been in private hands: fast, economical to operate, capable in confined waters, and useful for tasks that required quickness and flexibility rather than raw firepower. The survey vessels that mapped the world's coastlines in the great age of hydrographic exploration. Those painstaking, extraordinarily valuable expeditions that produced the charts on which all subsequent navigation depended, frequently employed brig-rigged vessels for exactly the reasons that had always recommended the type. They could go where larger ships could not, maneuver in shallow and poorly charted waters without excessive risk, and be worked by crews small enough to be sustained on the modest budgets that survey expeditions were typically allocated. HMS Beagle, perhaps the most famous survey vessel in history, the ship that carried Charles Darwin around the world between 1831 and 1836 on the voyage that would eventually produce On the Origin of Species, was a brig, her rig sharing the fundamental characteristics that had defined the brigantine type for 2 centuries. Darwin himself wrote about the ship with the mixture of affection and exasperation that sailors always seem to develop for the vessels they spend years living aboard. Acknowledging her seaworthiness while noting, with the honesty of a man who had suffered considerable seasickness in her, that she moved in the way that small vessels with full rigs always move in a heavy sea, which is to say energetically and without much regard for the comfort of her passengers. The Beagle represents something worth pausing over, a vessel whose lineage traces directly back to the Mediterranean brigantines of the 16th century, refined through 200 years of Atlantic trading and Caribbean piracy and colonial commerce, carried the man whose observations would reshape humanity's understanding of its own place in the natural world, to the Galapagos Islands, to the coast of Patagonia, to the coral reefs of the Pacific. The connection between the brigantine type and one of the most consequential scientific journeys in human history is not something that tends to appear in the standard histories of either sailing ships or evolutionary biology. It should. The coming of steam, when it finally arrived in earnest in the middle decades of the 19th century, did to the brigantine what it did to every sailing vessel type. It eroded her commercial position slowly, then rapidly, then completely. The steamship did not care about wind direction. It did not need to tack or wait for a favorable breeze. It arrived on schedule in a way that sailing vessels, hostage to the weather, could never quite guarantee. For merchants whose commercial lives depended on predictability, on knowing when cargo would arrive, when ships would be available, when commitments could be kept. This was not a minor advantage. It was transformative. The brigantine retreated before steam, the way a tide retreats before the morning. Gradually, with occasional reversals where the economics briefly favored sail over steam on a particular route or in a particular trade, but directionally and ultimately without possibility of reversal. By the final decades of the 19th century, she was a diminishing presence in commercial shipping. By the early 20th century, she was largely a memory. Her remaining examples confined to the most economically marginal trades, where the low operating costs of sail still just barely justified the unpredictability. But she did not disappear entirely. She never quite managed that. Sail training vessels preserved the brigantine rig into the 20th century and into the 21st, for the simple reason that sailing a square-rigged vessel in company with fore and aft canvas is an education in seamanship that no amount of classroom instruction can replicate. The physical understanding of wind and water that you acquire working the sheets and braces of a brigantine, feeling how the vessel responds, learning through your hands and feet and the particular balance of your body on a moving deck, what the abstract principles of sailing theory actually mean in practice, is the same understanding that the sailors of the Golden Age possessed, and that no other method of instruction provides with anything approaching the same completeness. She endures, then, Changed in context, diminished in number, but recognizable still. The same two masts, the same combination of square and fore and aft canvas, the same capacity, when the wind is right and the helmsman knows what they are doing, to move with that particular swiftness that 2.5 centuries of sailors described in terms that always reached, eventually, for something beyond the merely mechanical. She is still the ship that learned to disappear. And some ships, it turns out, are very difficult to make disappear entirely. There is a question that sits quietly beneath every serious study of maritime history, patient as the tide, waiting for the right moment to surface. It is not a question about ships, exactly, or about the men and women who sailed them. It is a question about what we are looking for when we look at these things at all, when we spend our time reconstructing the dimensions of a vessel that has not been built commercially in over a century, tracing the careers of men who died violently in shallow water 300 years ago, trying to understand a world of wind and salt and timber that is separated from our own by an experiential gulf so wide it can sometimes seem almost unbridgeable. Why does it matter? The honest answer, arrived at slowly and kept carefully, is this: because the Brigantine and the world she inhabited are not as distant from our own as the centuries between us suggest. The distances are real. The differences in material circumstance are enormous, but the human motivations that animated the Golden Age, the hunger for freedom from systems that felt arbitrary and unjust, the willingness to accept extraordinary physical risk in exchange for self-determination, the genius that emerges when conventional paths are closed and unconventional ones are forced open by necessity. These are not period pieces. They are not artifacts of a vanished era. They are recognizable. They are, in fact, familiar in ways that reward careful attention. Consider what the Brigantine actually represented to the men who chose her. She was not the most powerful vessel on the water. She was not the safest. She was not the most comfortable, a quality she shared with essentially every other vessel of the era, but which deserves acknowledgement nonetheless, because the romanticization of Golden Age seafaring has a tendency to soften the physical reality into something more picturesque than it actually was. Cold, wet, cramped, malnourished, perpetually at risk from weather and violence, and the dozen quiet ways that the sea finds to kill people who have committed themselves to living on it. This was the actual texture of life aboard a brigantine in 1715. The romance existed, but it coexisted with suffering in a ratio that most modern people, contemplating it honestly, would find deeply discouraging. And yet, the men came. They chose this over the alternatives available to them, and in many cases they chose it with an enthusiasm that the historical record preserves with surprising clarity. The deposition of a captured pirate, taken in Nassau, or Charlestown or Port Royal, frequently reveals a man who, when asked to account for his choices, does so with a directness that the officials taking down his words clearly found both frustrating and, occasionally, uncomfortable. The pay was better. The food was better. The treatment was more equitable. The decisions were made collectively. The shares were distributed according to rules that everyone had agreed to before the voyage began. This is not a defense of piracy. The violence was real. The suffering inflicted on victims was real. And the moral ledger of the Golden Age does not balance neatly in anyone's favor. But it is an honest account of what the men who chose the Brigantine over the alternatives were choosing between, and why. They were not simply choosing crime over law. They were choosing one set of social arrangements over another. And the set they chose, whatever its other deficiencies, offered them things that the legitimate maritime world of the early 18th century was structurally unable to provide. The Brigantine was the physical expression of that choice. Fast enough to preserve the option of escape, shallow enough to reach sanctuaries that authority could not follow into, crewed by small enough numbers that the spoils remained meaningful to each individual. She was engineered, by the accident of her design history, to serve the specific needs of men who had decided that the official world had nothing adequate to offer them. History has tended to organize the figures of the Golden Age into two categories, the romantic and the brutal. The romantic category includes Bartholomew Roberts, whose gentlemanly bearing and strict personal code have attracted a certain admiring literature. It includes Samuel Bellamy, the democratic idealist, who genuinely seems to have believed in something like economic justice, however violently he pursued it. It includes, inevitably, and perhaps inexhaustibly, Blackbeard himself, who understood that the line between the romantic and the brutal was itself a performance opportunity, and exploited it with a sophistication that has kept historians and storytellers productively occupied for 3 centuries. The brutal category contains the men who were simply violent without apparent philosophy, who used the absence of law to exercise cruelties that law would have constrained, and whose careers offer little that is instructive beyond the reminder that the removal of external restraint does not reliably produce better human beings. But this binary, comfortable as it is, misses the more interesting truth, which is that the Golden Age produced, in its brief extraordinary window, a genuine laboratory of social organization. The pirate articles, the written agreements that governed conduct aboard pirate vessels, allocating shares, establishing rights, defining punishments, were, by any serious reading, more egalitarian than the governing documents of most contemporary legitimate institutions. They extended meaningful rights to men who would have had no rights at all aboard a naval vessel or a merchant ship. They created, within the floating community of a brigantine at sea, something that resembled a genuine social contract in ways that the political philosophers of the era were only beginning to theorize about on land. This does not make piracy admirable. It makes it interesting, and the distinction matters, because the most honest engagement with history requires that we hold both truths simultaneously, the real suffering inflicted and the real social creativity embedded in the same enterprise. The brigantine herself, innocent of all philosophy, simply sailed. She carried slavers, and she carried the men who escaped slavery. She carried legitimate merchants, and she carried pirates. She carried naval officers conducting surveys that would advance the sum of human knowledge, and she carried smugglers moving contraband between islands in the careful darkness before dawn. She was, in this sense, a perfectly neutral instrument, as morally indifferent as the wind that filled her sails, available to whoever could handle her, shaped by whoever commanded her, defined entirely by the intentions and capabilities of the hands on her wheel and the minds behind those hands. This neutrality is part of what makes her enduringly fascinating as a historical object. A ship of the line is built for a specific purpose, organized state violence, and that purpose is inscribed in every aspect of her design. A brigantine has no such singular inscription. She is built for speed and versatility, and speed and versatility serve everyone equally well. She is a tool of pure capability, and the moral weight she carries is borrowed entirely from whoever uses her. That quality, the quality of a thing that is powerful and neutral simultaneously, has always attracted the most interesting people, the ones who operate outside the obvious categories, the ones for whom the question is never, what am I supposed to do with this, but only what can I do with this and how far can I take it. The sea itself has something to teach us here, if we are willing to listen in the way that it requires, which is quietly and without the impatience that the modern world has made into something close to a default setting. The ocean does not care about reputation. It does not acknowledge legend. It applies the same forces to every hull regardless of who built it, or who commands it, or what flag, if any, it chooses to fly. The water that lifted the Queen Anne's Revenge also lifted the survey vessels of the Royal Navy. The wind that drove Blackbeard down on a prize also drove the merchant fleets of a dozen nations between ports. The sea is the great equalizer. not in the sentimental sense that phrase is usually intended, but in the precise physical sense that it imposes identical demands on everyone who ventures onto it. The Brigantine's longevity, across 3 centuries and through configurations that shifted with commercial and military need, while preserving the essential logic of her design, is testimony to the fact that she had found an answer to those demands that was genuinely good. Not perfect, not unimprovable, but good enough to survive the scrutiny of generations of practical sailors who were not sentimental about vessel types that did not perform, who would have abandoned her without hesitation if something better had come along, and who kept returning to her instead, because the combination of capabilities she offered had not been bettered by anything that occupied a similar position in the spectrum of vessel size and complexity. She was right in the way that good solutions are right, not because they are the only possible answer, but because they are so well matched to the problem that changing them requires changing the problem first. What the water remembers, if we allow ourselves the small poetic license of imagining that it remembers anything at all, is the particular sound of a brigantine under full sail, not the thunder of a ship of the line delivering a broadside, not the creaking dignity of a great East Indiaman making her stately way across the Indian Ocean. Something quicker and more alive than either. The taut singing of rigging at the upper limit of what it is comfortable bearing, the hiss of a hull moving through water faster than its displacement strictly warrants, the snap of campers filling after attack, completed with the smartness that a well-drilled crew on a responsive vessel can achieve when everything is working as it should. That sound carried men to places they were not supposed to go. It carried them to sanctuaries that authority could not reach, to prizes that made fortunes in an afternoon, to battles fought in shallow water with a ferocity that the chronicles of the time set down with language reaching for adequacy and not quite finding it. It carried surveyors to coastlines that had never been mapped, and naturalists to islands that contained, waiting patiently in their isolation, the evidence that would eventually rewrite humanity's understanding of itself. It carried everything. It asked only wind and competent hands in return. The Brigantine is gone from the commercial sea now, gone from the naval inventories of the great powers. She exists in training vessels and tall ship festivals, in the careful reconstructions of maritime museums, in the lines of her hull preserved in the drawings of shipwrights who understood that what they were recording deserved to be remembered. She deserves to be remembered, not because of the violence, not because of the romance, which was always partly fabrication anyway, as all romance is, but because she was, for a brief and extraordinary window of time, the physical shape that human freedom took on the water. And because the water, wide and patient and without opinion, carried her wherever she chose to go.